Hey, welcome to CSIS. My name is Jim Lewis. The event is The Future of Quantum, Building a Global Market. We're lucky today to have three speakers who are true experts in the field. Admiral John Richardson, retired Chief of Naval Operations, now on multiple boards, including CNAS, I shouldn't say that, should I? CNAS and Woods Hole, and of course the Navy League. Joining him is Rima Oueid, who is the Senior Commercialization Executive, my goodness, Senior Commercialization Executive at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Technology Transition, an important player in this field. And then finally, Celia Merzbacher, Executive Director of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium. I'm having trouble today, aren't I? Who we're grateful to have you on again, Celia. You've been very generous with your time. So this is about building a, quote, global market, and we're going to look at potential applications at the market, and most importantly, at the timelines, and that still comes up a lot. Some people say quantum is further away than I think the speakers will tell you. The three applications we all know about, and we've had multiple events on, are quantum computing, quantum cryptography, and quantum sensing. Today, I hope we can talk a little bit more on sensing, but we can go wherever the speakers want to take us. The format today is after I finish speaking, now that I've introduced the speakers, and I should say their bios are available on our website. We'll have them make opening remarks for 5 minutes or so. Then we'll have a little conversation among the four of us. And we're open for questions from the audience. There's a button I think you can click to submit a question. Feel free to submit anything. And then we'll wrap up. So with that, let me turn to our speakers. John, can I start with you?
Sure, Jim, thanks. And thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure and just kind of an honor to be here with this panel. You know, as I see it, we're in the middle of kind of a real technical revolution, if you will, and quantum being part of a sort of a family of technologies that are, you know, I think revolution is really the right word. If you think about not only quantum, but artificial intelligence, biotech, I think some of the advanced nuclear opportunities that are out there really kind of define an inflection point in technology, which will allow us to do a lot of the things that we're doing right now better and faster and probably cheaper. But these technologies also will allow us to do things that we simply could not have ever done before. I mean, we will be doing new things with these technologies, and many of them, some of those things that we'll be able to do will render what we're doing now obsolete. Okay, and so there's a real sort of, you know, new horizon out there that we're crossing. And, you know, I would also say related, since I'll kind of speak to the national security implications of this, is that, you know, there's an inflection point going on in the global strategic environment as well, as we see this rise of China and Russia, you know, Russia invasion of Ukraine, where, you know, many of these advanced technologies, unmanned, et cetera, are coming to bear on the battlefield. So, you know, this sort of brings an additional sense of urgency that we're not the only ones out there trying to develop and deploy these technologies. And there's a real competition, right, for global influence. And so these two things are intertwined. And so, you know, I just see this as, you know, if we can just get and instill a sense of urgency in the development and fielding of these technologies, I think that the government has, you know, a key role in this. There's going to be a lot of this that happens in the public sector, and a lot of it that'll happen in the private sector. But with many of these technologies that are going to define this, you know, inflection point and help us get through, particularly the first articles, I think that the government can play, you know, a tremendously helpful role. Certainly there's a regulatory role. You know, there's going to be just, you know, a real need for regulating these technologies as we define new protocols. Some of these things, as I said, are going to be done for the very first time ever. How do we regulate that? And the government's role in that is undeniable. But doing that, not only thoroughly and thoughtfully, but at pace, is going to be a real challenge. I think from a market standpoint, the government can play a real key role. Certainly, we will be, customers for this technology, and we can talk about specific applications of that, later on as we go through our discussion. But that's for all of those companies that are out there developing these technologies. Many of them startups, many of them looking to make a disruptive change. Having kind of a customer at the end of this is a real stabilizing factor from their financial standpoint. And then also, I think the government can provide, it's a little bit at odds with being a customer, is also provider, right? So many users of these quantum types of technologies and the benefits that they can bring, well, these are pretty sophisticated devices and, oftentimes expensive. And, companies are just not going to be able to afford to develop their own quantum infrastructure, if you will. But if there's sort of, quantum as a service or quantum in the cloud that the government could assist in providing to them, they can develop all the use cases. And then finally, I think the government has a tremendous role in just sort of continuing to build the quantum workforce, the quantum expertise. That's a real market. And if you listen to some briefs on it, some of our competitors in this market are just trying to, corner the market of expertise. And, that really can have an impact in terms of how fast we can move to field these. And I think that, just like any kind of market force, there's a real advantage to being a first mover here. So I think by doing these things, the government can be extremely helpful in creating the market, both in the public and private sector, that will certainly advance our national security from, not only a military standpoint, but I think also from an economic standpoint and an informational standpoint. And so, I think for sort of opening remarks, Jim, I'll pause here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. That was a great kickoff. Rima, can I ask you for some opening remarks?
Sure. Thank you again for having me as well. I am very much honored to be here amongst all of you. So at the Department of Energy, we're working on quantum from the standpoint of basic science research, but also looking at it all the way across the spectrum into commercialization and deployment. And one of the things that we realize at DOE is that energy is a potential consumer of quantum technologies. And so although Congress in its infinite wisdom funded us to do the basic science research instead of these quantum information science centers, 5 of which are out there, we're also looking at, well, how do we also benefit from these technologies? And are there things that we could benefit from earlier rather than later? So although the Office of Science was funded to help build a quantum network and a fault-tolerant gate-based quantum computer that can essentially answer the fundamental laws of nature at some point, right? That's the vision. But we also know that there are near-term applications and near-term computers that we can also take advantage of. And so we're looking at those applications, and those applications are pointing towards some promising feedback with respect to optimization and even contingency analysis, which is something that we need to do for the grid. And what's interesting is, well, in terms of optimization, the use case potential there is quite broad when you think about the different types of activities the grid has to manage. And with the grid now becoming this distributed system, a system of distributed networks that have to coordinate and optimize, and that creates opportunities not just for quantum computing to optimize that system, but there's also opportunity for quantum sensing technologies to do anomaly detection, for quantum atomic clocks to do position, navigation, and timing, because our grid is not only connected to renewable energy assets, but also electric vehicles that could put power back on the grid. And so we need to know where they are, and we need to also know when they're available. And so quantum sensors and quantum clocks could be deployed onto vehicles that become assets to the grid. So that these creative use cases that we're exploring, that we're realizing, create a whole new set of market potential for quantum technologies. And then obviously security is just a no-brainer. We're going to need security. And there could be opportunity there for QKD, as well as post-quantum cryptography and quantum entanglement for communication across all of these new assets that will be interconnecting with the grid and talking to the grid. And if you deploy it on the grid, that doesn't mean that you can't then later exploit those same technologies in other use cases. We're already talking to other infrastructure providers, like the transportation industry, for example, that is also interested in leveraging these very same technologies for their own applications. I mentioned quantum computing and optimization. The other thing to keep in mind is NIST computers might also have some application today on the grid, because you have on the grid, when we run our contingency analysis, it's based on heuristics, it's based on probability. We don't need an exact answer. We need a range of probabilities, and we take the best one. And this is where a NIST computer could potentially already provide value. And we've done some preliminary work to see that, yeah, the answers come pretty quickly relative to a traditional computer, a classical computer. And by the way, it may use less power. So that's another thing, another dimension that we are also thinking about with respect to computing. It's not just, can we get the answers with the same level of fidelity? Can we get it within the same amount of time or better? But how much power are we utilizing in order to get that answer? So these are the areas that we're also pursuing and researching to figure out what applications make sense. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's a surprise to most folks to know that we think quantum computing and classical computing will be combined, that there'll be hybrid architectures that we'll be taking advantage of and layering these things on top of one another, where certain algorithms will be run classically and others will be run on quantum computing. And so all of these things are being explored, and the grid is a fantastic sandbox for us to test some of these ideas. And so I'm very excited about the future. I do think that there are near-term applications that we can already begin to play with. There's applications for computing, sensing, and communications that are near-term, and then there are certain use cases that are going to be further out. And our role is to figure out what can we do now and what can we work towards in the future. So I think this is an exciting time to be at the front lines, and this is an opportunity for us to think creatively and outside the box. And we're also seeing it's really, really important for us to bring together people that are not just quantum experts, but industry experts, people that have the problems, that can ask the right questions, and bring these folks together to really do the brainstorming. And that's something that we've been doing. And we've been doing it very closely with our partners like QED-C, for example, where we've put together workshops where we've blended the energy industry folks, computational mathematics folks, and then quantum physicists, and had all these different perspectives at the table together to brainstorm. And that's the kind of activity that we need to continue going forward. What we've realized is that we need people with deep expertise, but ultimately it's blending that deep expertise with a diversity of backgrounds that allow for essentially us to dabble and make connections that weren't made before in order to figure out what will work and what needs more research. And so we're discovering that along the way, and it's been incredibly fruitful. So I think with that, I will pause and hand it over to Celia, but happy to take any other additional questions. And again, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to think of the grid as a sandbox. It's probably the first time we've ever said that. But and then I want to come back later to the question of near-term applications. But let's conclude the opening remarks with Celia, who of course is well known to our audience. Celia, thank you for coming again.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with the other panelists. And going last, I can just say I agree with everything that both John and Rima have said. I've been sort of scribbling a couple of notes to myself that I'll, I guess, add to their remarks. First of all, the title of today's session, Building a Global Market for Quantum, I think really emphasizes that global nature of the activity and the whole enterprise. Quantum innovation is happening all around the world. Many countries are putting very strategic programs in place. Some of them have been around longer than the one that the US has launched in 2018 formally. And so there's a real sense of opportunity and also competitiveness. Even among friendly countries, I think there's a sense that this is a really open sort of Wild West that we're experiencing. And so everyone wants to be sure that they're at or near the front and are making very strategic investments to ensure that. As a result, there's no sort of one leader, and the US is in the position of really having to be collaborative and working with international partners to, go forward as quickly as possible and achieve the potential and the benefits. It's also a sort of classic enabling technology for all kinds of both commercial and government purposes. And so there's a sort of blending of national security interests with economic interests. And that is almost sort of natural, I think, with emerging technologies today. And so we sort of have to use the tools that we have for both promoting and protecting technology in a really sensitive and sensible way. So there are a number of programs that are in place already and others that have been proposed but not yet funded. And I'd like to maybe shine a light on some of those. The CHIPS and Science Act, if you pull it up and just search for the word quantum, I think it appears more than 120 times. So there's quite a lot of quantum programs that are called for in that legislation. Much of it is in the area of sensing and networks and communication. So those are areas where it requires infrastructure, it requires pulling together multiple stakeholders to make progress now. Another program that was mentioned in the CHIPS and Science Act is the QUEST program, which stands for Quantum User Expansion for Science and Technology, a clever acronym that's pronounceable. And QUEST is intended to put some funds into a pot where researchers could go and apply for those and use them to do research on privately owned quantum computer systems. So the quantum computers that are out there today, many of them are available on the cloud already to researchers. Companies like IBM, like Quantinuum, like D-Wave, and others have made their cloud-based systems available. And what this program would do would just make it really easy for researchers to be able to experiment on existing quantum computers. They're advancing rapidly, and so it doesn't make sense at this point necessarily for the government to buy a quantum computer and put it at a government laboratory and then allow people to use it. Rather, this concept would leverage the sort of currently available privately owned systems, but would facilitate research access. And that would do two things. It would obviously promote research in the space of quantum computing. It would get multidisciplinary researchers from computer science and engineering and fields of physical science, all kicking the tires, so to speak. But of course, when you fund researchers to use something, often it's the students who are doing the work. And so you're training students who then graduate and go to work for a quantum company or a user company, perhaps. So I think it's a real win-win-win all the way around. And we hope that that program will get funded now that it's authorized. I'd also like to mention that because you have a very international audience, I believe, there are going to likely be interests, and I think John sort of referenced the regulation of the technology. There's some discussions going on and information being gathered about what those controls might look like. And whereas quantum computing has poses some risks, because a sufficiently powerful quantum computer would break the encryption that we use today to do business on the internet and so on. There's an effort that's being led by the U.S. Department of Commerce National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. It's a very community-based, open process for developing new standards that will be quantum resistant, and those are expected in the next year or so. And they would, when adopted, would protect our IT systems from attack by a quantum computer. So that's the sort of protection by putting in place new encryption standards. Using something like export controls to prevent adversaries from even perhaps being able to develop a quantum computer that could do such attacks is another tool in the toolbox, and one that's being looked at, and I think needs to be used very carefully, because it's early days still. We don't even have the actual technology settled upon. There are many different kinds of quantum computers being developed. And so while it's smart to be thinking about it and looking at how you might go about preventing adversaries from having access, or at least slowing that access, you can sort of debate whether regulatory regimes prevent or not. But you don't want to slow your own progress at the same time. So I think there's a lot of interesting policy questions that are on the table, and this is a very timely event. So thank you for pulling this panel together, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Celia. That was actually going to be my first question, and I'll turn to John and Rima. But when we started setting up this session, and the reason I said global markets is one of the first things that came up was export controls on quantum computing and where did we want to put them? So let me ask a slightly broader question to John and Rima. John, I think you mentioned regulation. What does regulation look like for you? What would be the ideal starting regulatory framework for the US when it comes to quantum? And I know that's a very broad topic. It could be exports, it could be research, it could be safety. But when you think about regulation, what are the hot spots for you?
Yeah, I think I would probably start with safety. And, I defer to my other panelists in terms of being the real experts in terms of the global market. But I think that certainly as a minimum, you'd want to be the regulatory and policy framework would want to guarantee some safety. The idea of export controls, boy, that's a knife that cuts both ways, right? And whether we can even control something like this without having kind of a more hindering effect on our own system is a really lively debate. But that's where I would begin, Jim, is kind of something that would sort of establish this a framework that can help us proceed in a way that's largely regarded as safe. And then I think that also would help us to retain what both of my fellow panelists have described as sort of the agility or the speed to be able to move at pace in these things. As both of them said, it's a pretty remarkable technology. It can be potentially disruptive. And I would say that even with all the challenges that Celia mentioned, the United States and its allies and partners would want to do everything they can to be in the lead in this, so that, in terms of setting the initial direction, even from a regulatory standpoint, we can have that first mover advantage.
Thanks. Yeah, I think some common themes are emerging from the remarks from all three of you, but let me ask Rima what she would think about. When you hear the word regulation, do you recoil in horror, or what do you do?
Well, I agree with the comment that it's a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, regulation can be helpful because sometimes, there are market failures, right? And so regulation kind of helps create some boundaries to help us figure out what attributes we want to value on whatever system it is or whatever the goals are, and it gives us some boundaries, right? But at the same time, I do think, President Biden recently, last year, put out a memorandum asking all of the federal agencies to become quantum secure. And as a result of that, there's a series of activities that have begun involving inventorying our cyber protocols, for example. And as a result of that, we're also thinking about, well, all right, so this is, we're realizing, well, where did some of these technologies come from? And we're realizing what types of technologies we're utilizing to provide security, whether it be to protect our communications, our infrastructure, and so questions have come up as to whether or not we are able to properly secure technologies that come from different places, and so it creates sensitivities, right? And so the question is, do we expose ourselves because we want to move quickly and get the technology regardless of where it comes from, or do we prioritize security, and do we protect ourselves by being insular? But does that then stifle innovation? It's something we're still grappling with. I don't know if I have a good answer yet, right? Or if we have a good answer yet. I think we're going to have to figure it out along the way, but it's a process that we're currently involved in. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know. It's a tough question because I know that there's very strong opinions on different sides, and we're going to have to approach this very thoughtfully.
Let me build off those remarks. I'll turn to you first, Celia, but people talk sometimes about technological surprise, and I usually don't believe in it, but quantum technology is one of the few places where I think you could get technological surprise. And in the business world, it might be called disruption. I mean, that's sort of the commercial variant of technological surprise. But if we wake up one day and it turns out the Chinese know how to use quantum to decrypt, or if we wake up one day and somebody has figured out how to do quantum sensing in a way that affects submarines or stealth, that would be a surprise, and maybe not a happy surprise. But when you think about technological surprise, or when you think about the rapidity of change, what do you think about? And Celia, let's start with you.
Well, I think that on the one hand, quantum is it's really a set of technologies, and there's a lot of enabling technology that goes along with understanding the sort of key quantum sort of processor or qubit at the heart of the system. And so when you have such a complex set of technologies that need to all come together, I think it's more challenging to have, a sort of leap ahead surprise. I think there will be awareness and sort of signals that will indicate that progress is happening. And even just at the kind of qubit level, the news that you read in the press coming from companies that have, are making big bets, that they have made progress along their roadmap, that they have demonstrated a larger number of qubits, a better form of error correction. These are all signs that progress is happening, and are sort of pieces of bricks in the wall that's going to have to be built here. And so I think while there may be some real leaps that happen, especially perhaps in the algorithm space, for instance, there needs to be also a lot of hardware development and other pieces that are going to make it a little bit challenging, I think, for there to be really total surprise. That would be my guess. Or hope.
I'm going to touch that one. You
Yeah.
have experience with some of the key national security applications that could be at risk.
Right. Yeah, Jim, I think a good example of, was it a surprise or not? It might be, Chat GPT, right? So there's a lot of folks that are claiming that this was some kind of, they're claiming that they were surprised by this type of capability. But I think that those experts in artificial intelligence and those sorts of things, just as Celia said, we're tracking this along that path for some time, and we're actually, not as surprised as maybe many others allowed themselves to be. And I kind of use those words deliberately because I agree with you that true technical surprise is a pretty rare thing, that you stumble on something or something happens so quickly that it really is, surprising to everybody. It really is a matter of what have you been tuning into. And, I think in all of these areas, particularly in quantum, there's a lot of people tuned into this, just as Celia said. And so I hope that we don't allow ourselves to be surprised by the advances in quantum by virtue of just not keeping up with, our reading, I guess. And, one area where this is important is it's not sensing. Hopefully we can touch on sensing sometime during the discussion, but this idea of quantum cryptography and post-quantum cryptography. I mean, it might be some time, I don't think decades, but sometime before there's a real stable computer that can get after, decrypting some of the more advanced cryptographic algorithms. But, this is what quantum computers do really well. They're really, I think, well suited for this P versus NP type of problem. But the things that we can do right now, though, are legitimate ways to make progress. And so, one of the vulnerable situations is that even though the computers aren't here to decrypt now, well, people are downloading and trying to steal the information, the databases that are encrypted now. They'll store them. And then when the computer comes along, they'll rip through those things in minutes, right, and decrypt them all. And so this store now, decrypt later type of an approach is a real vulnerability. And that information, even a couple of years or a decade down, it'll still be very valuable once decrypted. And so what can we do, to start to prepare ourselves for this post-quantum quantum cryptography world? Well, there's things like inventorying everything that we need to put in that database, right? And then, what are going to be the steps that we take towards this post-quantum cryptological world, encryption world? And then, we could even maybe do some cost estimating and really kind of prepare ourselves for this, this machine that will appear at some point, so that when it happens, indeed, we're not surprised. Not only are we not surprised, but we're right up to the moment in terms of being prepared for this breakthrough and are as ready as possible, both offensively and defensively, I guess, to bring this technology and adopt it and make use of it as quickly as possible. So, I think I share the sense of Cecilia and yourself that true surprise is rare, but that doesn't, prevent us from, possibly falling behind and allowing ourselves to be surprised.
Great, thank you. Rima, you talked about applications for the grid that I would consider disruptive, maybe not a surprise, but where would that fit in here? What's the implication for quantum there?
Well, the grid is a critical asset, right? And so a surprise would be someone takes the grid down and it takes months for us to get it back up again, right? And that could happen. And that could happen because of quantum. It could happen because of an EMP. But quantum could also be an asset in helping us to bring the system back up, potentially, depending on where we are at the time. So this is why I think there's such an urgency for us to start learning by doing. And so if we are surprised, we have enough tools in place to help us recover. And I think quantum technologies could potentially also help us recover, or at least compartmentalize the problem. John mentioned quantum sensing. Wanting to get to that, I think quantum sensing is a great example of a technology where it could be utilized to identify anomalies and help us protect against them and compartmentalize them early on. So, I think we want to use these technologies now to become as resilient as possible, and also allow ourselves to use these technologies to become more diversified. And so if the grid does get attacked, there is no single point of failure that can create a cascading effect, right? And we can start doing these things now.
Well, since it came up, let's talk about quantum sensing. Which applications do each of you find to be the most exciting when we think about quantum sensing? And it could be PNT, it could be, I don't know what it is. So you tell me. We'll go start again with Celia. What's the most, when you think of quantum sensing, what's the cool thing that you think is nearest to us when we talk now?
So QED-C, and I haven't really mentioned QED-C during this panel, but it's a consortium of stakeholders, and it's got a very diverse mix of corporate members. Our largest number of members is in the corporate space, and most of them are small companies. And they cover everything from quantum computing to communications and networking and sensing as well. And so we do a number of activities to help identify use cases. And one of our workshops last year was on sensing, use cases for quantum and sensing. So I just want to encourage the listeners today to go to the QED-C website. It's a publicly available report under our publications list. And in that report,
we'll put the link on the website for people.
Okay, yeah, I can exactly put it in the chat or something. That report focused a lot on sensing for applications that had national security utility. So being able to develop more accurate timekeeping devices, clocks, especially ones that are more compact and maybe can be put up in space and so on, would help address the potential threat of if GPS were to be taken out. We rely a lot on GPS for navigation and positioning of assets. And so more accurate clocks would allow for systems to operate for longer, even if GPS was not available. So there's important applications in that space. And reliance on GPS is not just a military thing by any means. Of course, we all use it all the time, and banks use it. All kinds of institutions rely on the GPS network for timekeeping. And so more accurate quantum-based clocks could be a big, important use case. Another I'll mention briefly, and then I'll let others chime in, is in biomedical imaging applications, where the electronic signals and fields that are generated in the brain can be detected. And so, for instance, in diagnosing epilepsy, looking at perhaps young children who can't hold still in an MRI machine, or just wanting to be able to do studies on people while they're doing activities and moving around, could be greatly enabled by quantum sensing. And there's some startups that are developing these kinds of applications today that are very exciting. There also are uses of quantum sensors. They're just so sensitive. They can be incorporated into diagnostic tools, for instance, also for biomedical applications. So those are some of the areas where I see quantum having relatively near-term uses.
Great, thank you. John, how about you? What's the quantum sensing application that's caught your fancy?
Yeah, no, I think, well, the ones that Celia mentioned are super exciting for sure. And I share that this is a dual use thing, right? I mean, this is not just the military. I just pile on to the biomedical sensing part because that has real, uses, because I think these devices are one, closer in time than we think, and they're also smaller in footprint, right? So some of these technologies are things that can literally be used in very forward types of medical scenarios in conflict or something like that, to provide tremendous information, right, to a doctor or a medic that may be there. But I think also I would add on that in addition to clocks, the magnetic anomaly navigation, right, is a real thing that excites me. Again, sort of addressing this reliance that we have on GPS. And, I think that in any real conflict, that GPS system is going to be one of the first targets, right? It's going to be, heavily prioritized in terms of jamming or whatever it might be. And so, these quantum magnetometers, super sensitive, can detect fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. We're on a big data gathering quest right now to map the Earth's magnetic field to a degree of detail that's helpful. But, think about the virtues of a system like that. One, it is very persistent. It's very difficult to jam the Earth's magnetic field, right? And so it's persistent. It's all weather, all domain, right? So it's impervious to those types of things, which can confound other approaches to this. It's passive, right? You don't have to transmit anything to find yourself in a particular place, with good precision in the world. And so, it's got all of those virtues. It solves a real national security and military problem, and a commercial problem as well. And so this idea of, and I think it's relatively near term, right? I talked to a lot of people, as you kind of alluded to in your opening comments, that it's like, yeah, I took a quick brief on quantum, and I made a note to myself to check on it again in 15 years. Those people are going to miss the beat, right? These things are going to be, I think, commercially available or usefully available much sooner than that. And I think that these quantum magnetometers are one of those things.
Great, thank you. Let me remind people, we're starting to get questions from the audience, so let me remind you, there's a button for you to submit your question if you want to, but we probably have more than we need now to take out the whole area, rest of the time, but better to have too many than too few. Rima, let me turn to you when you think about quantum sensing. And I noticed one of the things you mentioned was heuristics, the heuristic capability for managing the grid. But I'm not to point you in any direction, but when you think about quantum sensing, what's the top of the list for you?
Well, when I mentioned heuristics, I was thinking more in terms of quantum computing. But in terms of quantum sensing, I'm going to echo what Celia and John have said. I think PNT is a imperative right now for us. There's already a working group at the national level working across the federal agencies to look at ways to either secure or find alternatives to GPS. And the energy sector very much leans on the GPS system. I mentioned to you, that we have now this influx of electric vehicles, and they're going to be integrating with the grid, and we need to know where they are, and the more capacity, the more visibility we have into the things that are going to be interacting with our energy system, they can become vulnerabilities or assets. And I think quantum sensing is going to play a critical role in helping us determine whether it's going to be an asset or a liability. And obviously position, navigation, and timing is going to be a critical part to securing our infrastructure. So definitely excited about quantum sensing from that standpoint. But then also I mentioned that there's potential for us to use quantum sensing for anomaly detection, and that could be used for not just the electric grid, but also for pipelines. There's a lot of effort right now to figure out how we can deploy hydrogen, and that's a different type of fuel altogether. And quantum sensors can help us ensure that they could be used to track and prevent methane or leakage rather and add more toxicity into our atmosphere. We could also use it to deploy on bridges, and there's even talk about whether we could use quantum sensors on roads and asphalt, and so there's just the opportunities and the use cases around quantum sensing are vast. The other area that we're looking at quantum sensing is not just tracking our infrastructure and the status of how our pipelines and so forth are performing, but also we could use them to do subsurface level analysis and do more precision exploration of oil and gas, so that we're not hurting as much of the environment if that activity needs to continue. But it can also be used to potentially identify geothermal or caverns underground where we could potentially store carbon and or find water where we otherwise would not have looked. So there's some exciting imaging capabilities here that we could exploit with quantum sensors, and so I think it's an exciting area to be focused in.
Great. Yeah, a lot of this is really appealing. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, Jim, I'm sorry to, I just have to pile on Rima's comments about magnetic anomaly detection, because I think I'd be voted off the island of submariners if I didn't mention that it's, there's a real potential there, right? One of the most effective ways of detecting a submarine right now is with the magnetic anomaly detector. You take that detector and make it several orders of magnitude more sensitive now, and you've got a real challenge on your hands. And so this is another reason why we want to be kind of first movers here if we can be.
Yeah, that improving MAD would be a big step forward. So that would be cool.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the questions we got was one of the questions I was thinking about, but it's a little different. Let's start with that. What is needed to work with allies on global market creation and deployment? So that's, I think we talk, I know the president just signed, the White House just signed an agreement with the Netherlands on quantum cooperation. We've got them with a few, it's part of AUKUS, certainly. What does international cooperation look like? Celia, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I would actually. I think there are a number of forms that might take. Certainly, there have been a number of statements signed between the U.S. and others with the sort of expressed intent to promote cooperation and collaboration. And that can start, the sort of easiest place for that kind of activity to sometimes start is at the basic research stage. And university researchers naturally collaborate with their colleagues around the world. And so making that easier, maybe coming up with programs where there's funding available for those kinds of collaborations from both sides would be an example. Also, just people mobility, the ability of people to easily go between countries in order to work together. And whether that's in the university setting or at an industry kind of setting, that would be, I think, very helpful to both sides in strengthening relationships. Because we haven't mentioned this term, but supply chains are important here too. And those are also very global. And so making connections at the industry level between some of the leading companies in areas like lasers and cryogenic technologies and optics and photonics, for instance, in other countries with companies in this country that are developing the systems using those, are the kinds of collaboration that I would hope might emerge on the industry side. We talked earlier about export controls, and I do want to kind of draw a line under multilateral export controls, because it really doesn't make sense for any one country to try to put a wall around its technology at this point. There really needs to be a multilateral approach to those kinds of activities. And I guess one other area that we haven't talked about that would benefit from international partnerships is standards. setting and benchmark setting and agreeing upon how we're going to test and characterize. I mean, those are the early kinds of standards that are needed, and those are inherently going to be multinational.
Celia, it sounded like you were questioning the great cliche, higher walls around fewer goods, which always bothers me because it was developed in the 1980s. So might be a little out of date, but we can come back to that, whether higher walls make any sense. But John, let's maybe turn to you. What does international cooperation look like when you think about it?
Yeah, I think we're starting to move into this realm, and we'll have to just sort of experiment our way forward, Jim. But I'm involved a little bit in the AUKUS agreement as well, and one of my hopes is that by virtue of involving three very, very close partners, Five Eyes partners who already share a tremendous amount of sensitive information, we can use this agreement not only to kind of deliver the capability that it's all centered around. And I might say that pillar 2 of that agreement talks about technologies that are not associated directly with the nuclear submarine, and quantum is one of those. And I think, to Celia's point, we will be often the recipient of information, right, from other countries, our allies and partners who may have taken a lead in some of these quantum technologies. And so we have to make sure that whatever kind of regime, information sharing regimes, technology sharing regimes that we define for the 21st century are sensitive to two-way flow here, right? We're not going to be the provider of all of the advances and particularly, I think, in quantum. And so, when you think about ITAR and all of those restrictions, I like the multilateral approach, and we can use technology that wasn't in place in the 80s, really, to kind of tailor an information sharing and a technology sharing situation, agreement, protocols, almost to an individual partner, right? And, kind of dial it right in using software-based techniques that would drive hardware, that would allow exchange of information and technology. And so I'm very hopeful that the AUKUS agreement might be used to define much more useful protocols in that regard, and that once that achieves a momentum of its own, that those protocols can then be used much more broadly with other partners to make coordinated advances in technologies like quantum.
Energy certainly is something that has a global remit. When you think about cooperation, what do you guys look? You guys look at it at DOE? What are you doing on international cooperation?
So at the DOE, we've had international cooperation agreements with other countries, and I think a good example is where we've just signed an international agreement with the European Union on AI. And I think that kind of helps provide somewhat of a framework that we can sort of model against for quantum as well. Our national labs do also sign agreements individually with various nations where they've built partnerships with specific universities and institutions abroad. And there are some countries where they're not allowed to do that with, and then there are others where they are. And so they can do that on an ad hoc basis. But there is a potential for us to do something that is much more formal and broader, that sort of encompasses the entire Department of Energy. And if we do something like that, I want to echo what Celia and John have said, in that it needs to be something that is multilateral, that addresses supply chain issues, because that is something that I hear a lot from our labs as a concern, to ensure that they are getting the types of components and resources to build even components themselves, and so there could be some cooperation that can alleviate some of those concerns. going forward. Workforce is another one, right? We do have workforce issues. We can't produce PhDs overnight. That takes time, but we could leverage PhDs from other countries, and that can help. And I know there are a lot of people that want to come to America and work here, so it's a great way to extend the olive branches abroad and build those relationships. And then also when it comes to the learning process and the information development piece, we do want to make sure that it is, whatever data and information is being shared is mutually beneficial. And that part can be a little tricky. And that's something that we need to figure out how to do well so that it's not just a one-way street. So that's something that I think we're going to have to work on as we move forward and sort of, again, learn by doing, which is what we're essentially doing here, right?
Yeah, no, I think if we have time, we'll come back to workforce, because I used to have a bumper sticker that said the side with the most physicists wins, but that was on an old car. So let me do one that we've touched on a couple times here, and it's not entirely fair, but we've touched on timeline. Every one of you has brought up timeline. So, and maybe instead of talking, it'd be nice if you want to give a precise prediction, 2027, no doubt. Feel free. But maybe a better way to approach it would be to think, what are the indicators, what are the metrics that people ought to look at, investors ought to look at when they're thinking about the timeline for the deployment and use of quantum? I don't know who wants to go first on that one. I'll leave it up to you. Celia, I know you've written about this, so maybe we'll...
Well, I don't know, written. Yeah, this is the most frequently asked question, I will say. And there sort of are two. One is, what is this quantum going to be good for, and when am I going to have it? And we don't really have 100% answers for either of those questions right now. And just to sort of illustrate how hard it is, there is a market analyst report that came out in 2020 and then again in 2021. And it looked like their projections for the end of the decade or so, the markets had shrunk. But I think all that really meant was that the timelines had actually extended. Their assessments now projected that it was going to take a little longer. So I think there's a lot of confidence that there are large applications, use cases, and markets out there. Just the question of how long it's going to take to get there. And I sometimes like to say, it's hard to predict who's going to win a marathon at mile one. And that's kind of where we are today. So I'm not going to give you a year or a finish time to this marathon, but I'm confident we're going to finish it, and that it's going to emerge over a long period. So some of these applications are relatively near, some of the sensing use cases, and others, maybe even some quantum computing applications that can benefit from relatively low performance machines will be uncovered, and then we'll build on those. So stay tuned for more.
John, when you think about this, and when you think about it either as an investor or as a military planner, what's your thinking on timing? Is it, and we've been kidding throughout the thing about the people who've told us, oh, it's years, decades away, we don't need to think about it. I think
right.
Don't agree that's right. But where do you think?
Right.
You look at
I think this is another, we've talked a little bit about surprise today as well, right? And this is an area where I think we don't want to let ourselves be surprised. One of the things that has been mentioned by both of my colleagues on the panel is that this is moving pretty quickly, right? It is moving faster. We're making progress faster than most of the predictions. And if we're not making progress that fast, others are, right? And so we certainly want to be laying as much of the groundwork to be ready to receive these technologies now. As I said, there are tangible, real, legitimate things that we can be doing right now to prepare ourselves for that, so that we're not starting from a dead stop, right, when it eventually happens. And so, to use the magnetic anomaly example, well, what's going to be our next move, right, after that detector becomes fieldable technology? Our physicists and everybody else should be thinking about that now, so that we're not losing time when that eventually hits the streets or hits the fleet. And so, I just, my sense is that without applying any sort of hard numbers to it, it's moving faster than we think. And so everything that we can do to prepare right now is time well spent.
Right. John, I know you have to leave, but let me turn to Rima for maybe the final remark on this series. We got one more question, and I don't know if we'll have time. We'll see if we do. But Rima, when you think about how you plan at DOE, what's the timeline you use for planning?
Well, given that the DOE and our sister agencies have been asked to prepare against a quantum computer now, we've started that process, right? That we just held our symposium last week where we were digging into how to protect against a quantum computer that can essentially hack Shor's algorithm. And that was just last week where we had the symposium. And so that the work is already underway. And something that I don't think people appreciate is that the reason it's hackable is because, our keys today are not based on actual, on true random number generators. They're based on algorithms that are classically based. However, there are available today companies that provide quantum random number generators, commercially available today. So we don't have the full suite of solutions available today, but we have pieces of it. And we can start acquiring those pieces and start putting them together today. So I would predict today, right? Just based on that feedback, right? And then we are starting with some basic quantum technologies, and then we're going to continue to build until we get the most advanced in place. And the most advanced is that fault-tolerant quantum computer. But the basic tools we have available today, and so we can start deploying them.
I mean, John had to leave, and we are at the end of the time, but this last question that we just got would be one I'm going to ask you both to comment briefly on. The question is, what lessons can we learn on deployment of quantum technologies from previous technologies, such as semiconductors or artificial intelligence? There's some other ones we could put in there, but quickly, what are the deployment lessons that you look to when it comes to quantum?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of positive lessons to learn from those other technologies. The semiconductor world, which I actually was sort of embedded in and part of for a while, it was an enabling technology that, as it sort of emerged and improved through miniaturization and scaling and following Moore's law over many years, was sort of deployed and put out into the world for users to use as they saw fit. It was really enabling, and it wasn't sort of planned almost how it would be used. And I think quantum technologies are going to be very similar to that. We can talk about use cases now, and we can imagine some of them, but there are very likely going to be ones that we haven't even imagined. And so I think it's not a technology that can be constrained, and that in fact it's going to be enormously, you can say, disruptive or enabling in so many ways. And I think it's important to run fast and be among the leaders in developing it and ultimately benefiting from it.
Great. Rima, when you think about this, what do you look at do you use precedent? What's the ones you like?
Well, so when I think about like the semiconductor industry and what we learned there, I think they taught us some lessons on considerations for scaling, right? And I think we've learned those lessons, and we're trying to be thoughtful about the supply chain needs for quantum computing. I also work on artificial intelligence, and one of the things that we learned from the AI world is that we need to ensure that we don't suffer a quantum winter, and that perception unfortunately matters, but what that means is that we need to demonstrate that we are showing progress, which we are demonstrating, but we need to get that information out and make sure that people are aware of that, and share those nuggets of success, and show that even though we don't have a fault tolerant quantum computer today, that we're learning so much along the way, and that we're producing quantum technologies along the way that are useful today and in the near term, and that will buy us the time that we need to get to that fault tolerant quantum computer. And so, I think patient capital is going to be really important in helping us get across the finish line, and the government is one source of that, right? But government's also a customer, and I think that this is why creating sandboxes for us is going to be so important.
Great, Rima, that's a really positive note to end on. So let me thank Celia once again for joining us. Let me thank you. I'll thank John later when I can catch up with him. But a great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.